Good morning, church. How are we doing? You know, sometimes it's just the little things in life that bring you so much joy. I started buying these shirts that are made for tall people, and I was worshiping. I was like, I can lift up both my hands, and people can't see half of my torso. And I'm just so happy about that right now. I just had to share that joy with you. It has nothing to do with anything. Well, when my wife was pregnant with our daughter, Winnie, we were wisely encouraged to have a plan for when labor began. We didn't want it to be like in the movies where the moment happens and you're just running around flailing your arms and panicking. You don't know what to do. So we sat down together and we started writing out a plan, trying to figure out, who are we going to contact right away? What do we need to bring with us? How do we just want this whole process to happen? And so we're there writing it down, and I raised a concern of mine, and you need, for a little bit of context, I've been accused before of being a coffee snob. I make my coffee at home, and I always make sure it's high quality beans that are roasted locally. I heat up the water to the exact right temperature, between 195 and 205 degrees, of course, and then I weigh out the coffee to 24 grams with my scale. I grind it, and then when the water is the right temperature, I manually pour it over the filter until I reach exactly 400 grams. And then I wait to make sure, check the timer, that it does not take longer than 3 minutes and 30 seconds for this to happen. This is very important. I do this every single day. And at first my wife complained about it, but now if I don't do it that way, she's like, what is this? Is this Starbucks? What is this garbage? So she's kind of gotten used to that too. But So I raised this deep concern of mine about this process of my wife giving birth to our child. You see, this question, I knew that this process takes hours and hours, usually, sometimes going through the night. And so I raised, this deep question was burning within me. How am I going to have high quality coffee during this whole process? And so me being completely sound in logic, I presented this to her. I said, well, I'm probably going to need to bring on my coffee gear. And at some point, when there's a lull or something, I can go off and make coffee. And she emphatically told me, you are not wandering off to go find hot water so that you can make coffee while I'm trying to give birth to our child. And the stupidity continued on my end as I responded. I should have kept quiet at this moment, but I said, well, it's not like it's going to be hard the whole time, right? And you probably guess this did not go over well. So that brings me to the topic of the day, which is wisdom. And I share this story with you because I was trying to rack my brain to come up with some good personal stories of me being really wise. And really, I just had way more stories about me being stupid. So I thought I'd share that with you instead and humble myself before I speak to you. Well, before moving on, I think it would be helpful to actually define what wisdom is, particularly from a biblical perspective. And I really like this definition that's going to be on the screen. John Piper says that the greatest human wisdom is the factual knowledge and the situational insight and the necessary resolve that together have the greatest likelihood of success in achieving the intended righteous goal. I like that. It's kind of practical. You can kind of think through. So let's just analyze my wisdom in the story I shared, okay? We can see where I failed. I did not have the correct factual knowledge about the process of giving birth. I did learn, and I can tell you, if you didn't know, it is really hard the whole time. I now know that. I've gained that knowledge. And then my insight to act in the moment was incredibly foolish, as I should have been able to discern that I should probably prioritize my wife's needs over my own in this situation. And then finally having the resolve, if I know all these things, that I would be able to act wisely in this moment and choose the correct choice, which would be to keep my mouth quiet and not bring it up. Well, this is a silly example, but keep this definition in mind. I say this just to process this idea of wisdom, and we'll come back to more serious responses to our need for wisdom later on. But we've been looking at this Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, and we've been getting these insights from King Solomon, which for the most part are terribly bleak. You probably, even if you haven't been here, you read these words on the screen, you probably thought, that's really depressing. Yeah, I can't imagine finding these on a motivational poster, most of these quotes. I'm imagining in a classroom having a poster of a majestic mountain that just says, meaningless, meaningless, everything is utterly meaningless, to inspire the students to be better. But what Solomon observes and what all this is about is with him possessing all wealth and knowledge and wisdom and everything a person could want in that day, he just looks upon all of that he has and he just says, at the end of the day, it's just meaningless. It just doesn't matter. And we've been seeing how, in light of Christ, we're able to look back at these words that were written a long time before Christ and see how Jesus answers a lot of these questions and brings meaning to each of these things. So we're going to read Ecclesiastes chapter 8. We're not going to spend a lot of time here, so if you just want to look at the screen, you can. If you don't want to flip to it, starting in verse 16. It says, when I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know, they cannot really comprehend it. So this one's strange to me. I think it's easy for us to think, yeah, at the end of the day, pursuing wealth or happiness is going to leave us unfulfilled. It's going to be futile at the end of the day. But who wouldn't want more wisdom? How can he say that this is meaningless? The ability to discern and make good judgments, whether it's in our marriage or our jobs, faith, politics, making a huge decision about the next stage in our life. We could all use more wisdom. And for me, my mind goes to continue with, when he was born and I held her. There's a picture up on the screen here of me holding her. And I had this similar experience I'm sure every parent has had. I'd read books. I'd heard information about the best way to parent. I kind of thought, I have somewhat of an idea, and then I held her in my arms, and I realized, oh snap, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm responsible for this human being. And you better believe I started praying for wisdom in that moment, praying, please God, give me the wisdom to know how to parent this child well. And then I also think it's strange thinking now in our particular context, thinking about wisdom being meaningless, because I see a tremendous need for wisdom in our context. There's never been a time in all of human history that we've had access to more information. There's this thing, you've probably heard of it, it's called the internet, and with it, all human knowledge and information is literally at our fingertips. But I believe there's a great lack of wisdom. And how do we understand this? How do we interpret it? What do we make of all this? So why does Solomon conclude that there's a futility to the human pursuit of wisdom? Like I said, we know the answer is going to be Jesus. But before we get there, I want to give a little bit more context of the wisdom and the time that Jesus entered the world and did his ministry. Because wisdom did evolve over time since the time of Solomon. And the authority at the time on wisdom was found in Greek philosophy. And I want to focus for a moment on the school of thought called Stoicism. Pastor Nate briefly mentioned that before, but we're going to go a little bit more into this way of thinking. So the dominant way of thinking for the Stoics and for most Greek philosophers was built upon this foundational belief about their understanding of the world. From their understanding, the world around them, or the cosmos, had this order to it. It had a logical order. And so they looked at the way things were and they said, this has order and purpose and meaning. And so the term, and they went beyond that to even say it's so logical and rational that they defined it as being divine, not in a personal sense that we think of the divine, but this idea of it just being above themselves, this higher idea. And this term used to describe the logical, rational, and divine order of all things, which is what they built all of their wisdom on top of, was called logos. This term is where we get our word logic or logical. And so I can see some expressions. I'm probably boring a lot of you right now. Or maybe seems just irrelevant, like this is just stuff that deep thinkers with majestic beards sat around and talked about and considered. But according to Luc Ferry, the French politician and philosopher, he wrote, "The philosophical schools of antiquity, contrary to what happens today in schools and universities, place less emphasis on speech than on actions, less on concepts than on the exercise of wisdom." And so this is practical for us when we try to understand the context of this time, because it was from this logos that Greek philosophy built their understanding of ethics and morality and social structures, which were honestly a lot of times pretty morally bankrupt when we look at it now, with their view of women and the poor and other nationalities. But then a new idea entered the scene that literally changed the trajectory of history. And we see this, John writes it in his gospel to begin. He writes, "In the beginning was the Logos." In your English Bible, it probably says word. And of course, he's talking about Jesus. "In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made." So at this point, the Greeks are totally tracking with him. They say, yes, the Logos, it's divine, we get it, it's great, cool, that's old news. But then he goes on to do something that horrified them. He went on to verse 14. He says, "The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us." John drastically redefines this word. Logos is no longer the impersonal idea of the divine. And this is an unthinkable claim to make. That the Logos, the source of all we look to for wisdom, could be solely contained within one individual. And they made their disapproval very clear. They did not hesitate to tell them what they thought about this new idea. And we see that here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. This is going to be the main text we'll look at. So it's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, starting in verse 18. The Apostle Paul writes, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." So I'll stop here quickly. The root of the word translated as foolishness is where we get our English word moron. Okay, so they're not just saying, it's kind of a cute idea, we think it's kind of silly, but whatever, you do you. They said that is moronic. That is the dumbest thing we've ever heard. We cannot believe that you would say this. But he continues on, it says, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. The intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Jews demand signs, and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness, to Gentiles, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." So I believe it's in these words that the frustrations of Solomon could have been resolved. That in seeing the wisdom of Christ manifesting itself among them, that he could find meaning and purpose and true wisdom. Before Christ, there's just always something missing, and you see it, just this frustration and any attempts to find fulfillment in intellectual assent and trying to come up with these ideas that bring satisfaction always fell short. So let's go back and see how Christ is the wisdom of God with the definition of wisdom that we looked at earlier. He's God possessing all knowledge, possessing all factual knowledge that he could need for any situation. And then we see this all throughout the Gospels with the ability to have situational insight. I love seeing how Jesus responds differently in each interaction with people. He doesn't have a script that he goes off of. I've heard presidents of college will go and just give the same speech everywhere they go, or my dad was a district superintendent and he'd give the same sermon everywhere he went, and I heard it over and over again. But for Jesus, each interaction was just uniquely catered to that individual he's talking with. And then he had, in all of his power, the ability to always have resolve to do the right thing, no matter what the cost was. And so we can see Jesus sets an example for us of perfect wisdom. But what does this actually mean for us? If we just say, that's great, Jesus is wise, we're not wise, okay, like that's good for him, but what does this mean for us? And I think Paul answers that as well. So let's continue reading verse 26. He says, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential, and not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us the wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore it is written that the one who boasts in the Lord. We now have access and benefit fully from the wisdom of God. That's incredible news, isn't it? Yeah? Some of you think so? Even those of us who are foolish and say stupid things to our wives, we have access to the wisdom of God. And if we humble ourselves, we can access this wisdom. We can better understand God through this. But that's exactly the hard part that Paul talks about here. We can't boast about this wisdom. And so for those who viewed this and still view this today as utter foolishness, for me it's partially comforting knowing that this idea that with kind of mocking and thinking that Christianity is crazy is not a brand new thing that people just came up with. It's been since the beginning. But it requires humility to submit to the wisdom of Christ. It's this ongoing submission to the wisdom of Christ rather than our own personal intellectual assent that we can earn and claim and boast. But according to Paul, this crazy thing, this foolishness, is actually the only true wisdom. And this was incredibly hard for people to wrap their minds around. A British headmaster named Edwin A. Abbott published a satirical novel in 1884 in which he imagines a world of individuals trapped in two dimensions. So picture with me a flat plane like a sheet of paper, and this is their world, and has boundaries on each end, and this is all that they know. And the beings that live there are shapes, just flat shapes that cannot look up and down. They can't move up and down. They just move side to side and forward and back. And this is the world that they understand. And so imagine with me how they viewed the world. To illustrate, I have this penny. I feel like I'm about to do a magic trick. This is a real penny, okay? So imagine if this is on, you can't really see it, but picture you have a penny on a flat surface, and if you look at it from the top, you see it looks like a circle. And then if you go down, I recommend not doing this in a public place if you're going to experiment with this. You might get some weird looks. You're like, oh, wow. But if you look from the vantage point of those that live in this world, all they see, it looks like a straight line from this side. That's all that they see are straight lines all around them. And this world is called flatland. And so they live in flat land, and they have social classes and hierarchies based on how many sides they have. And they exist in this world, and this is all that they know. Everything, their ethics, their morality, their understanding of math and science, everything is based off of this basic understanding that the world exists in two dimensions, and that is all that there is, and that is all that there ever will be. And so the narrator, who is a square, is abruptly encountered by a sphere. A three-dimensional being breaks into his home, which he doesn't have a roof because it's just, there's no height. So he just comes in. He has no idea how he appeared in his home and just tells him about this third dimension. But you see, the square still is limited by these two dimensions. And so all he can see is just this line. And so he can't see that it's a sphere. And so in this ongoing process, the sphere tries to convince him of this third dimension, and he always has a rational explanation for it. It can't be. There's only two dimensions. This is all that there is. Until finally, the sphere, fed up with this, takes him to his own world called Spaceland. And he takes him to Spaceland where there's this magical third dimension, and he sees for the first time that there is more than what he understood, more than he could possibly rationalize and think and process with his worldview. Why am I talking about shapes and dimensions right now? Well, think about what we've talked about so far. There was an intellectual framework at the time of Jesus. There were people in power who benefited from their understanding of the world around them. The unjust social structures and ethics depended on this worldview. And in enters an obscure Jewish rabbi who comes in and he tells them, there is more. There is another kingdom. Caesar is not God. I am. And he goes and he brings forth this otherworldly wisdom, and he breaks down these ideas of their structures, and he presents them with these ideas that regardless of people's wealth or their race or where they grew up or their gender, they have value as people. He started nothing less than a revolution on his time on earth. And it's no wonder why so many people stood to benefit by killing Jesus. He threatened all that they had, and they rejected it as foolishness and responded with violence. Yet more and more people were compelled by this wisdom of Jesus. Many Stoics became compelled by Jesus and ended up learning to follow the way of Christ. And people continue today in the year 2019 to be compelled by this wisdom of Christ. So far, we have established that we do have a deep need for wisdom. And we have read that Jesus is the source of all true wisdom, a wisdom that looks completely different than the world's wisdom around us. So how do we practically respond to this? Well, I just have 2 points for you. I know preachers are supposed to have 3 points, and it's bonus credit if you alliterate, but they do not alliterate, and there's only 2 of them, but they're pretty simple points for you today. The first one is to become a full-time student or disciple of Jesus. After all, being a disciple literally means to be a learner. Elizabeth kind of stole my thunder a little bit saying that, but to be a disciple means to be a learner. In the first century Middle Eastern context, it was the desire of many young Jewish boys and men to become a disciple of a rabbi. They committed their life to try to earn a place and rise to the top of their class so that they could follow a prominent rabbi. And then if accepted, they committed their life as a disciple to learn from and model everything after this rabbi, after their teacher. And so this would have been on Jesus' mind when he said in Luke chapter 6, he said, the student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. So for us to follow Jesus means to fully take on his teaching, to learn to think as Jesus thinks, to learn to live as Jesus lived, to learn from his wisdom. We are not part-time students of Jesus. We are full-time students and followers of Christ. So again, okay, that sounds good, but practically, how do we learn from this Jesus who lived 2,000 years ago? How do we learn from him today? Well, this is probably predictable for you, but I'm going to tell you to read your Bibles. And not just read it, but this is just an idea. This isn't the only way to do it, but I'd recommend, if you don't have this practice, start with one of the Gospels. Start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and then just read it. Carve out time. Read it every day. Couple chapters a day if that's all you have time for, and then reread it. Read it again. Read it slower. Meditate on it. Try to visualize the narratives, and constantly pray that the Spirit would break down your biases and your understandings about who Jesus is, the Jesus you've confined to your flat land, and your ideas and your wisdom that you've confined into. And I guarantee you, if you do this with an open heart and mind, you'll begin to learn more of who this Jesus is as you pray and study his words. And then in addition to that, there's all kinds of other spiritual disciplines that you can do that are helpful, but I'm not going to get into that right now. If you want to have a conversation with me, I'd love to talk with you about that. But for now, I'm just going to say that is a fantastic first step to becoming a student of Christ. And so this sounds good. We probably, most of us would say, yeah, I'd like to have more of that practice. I'd like to be more of a student of Christ. But I'm sure also in the back of your mind, you're thinking, that sounds nice in theory, but I have a real life with real responsibilities. After all, we live in a world with infinite distractions and competing commitments. And in addition to these other commitments, there's this constant noise all around you. Dallas Willard said that we are immersed in birth to death and wall-to-wall noise, silent and not so silent. He was writing about the bombardment of messages all around us about what to believe and how to think and how to, the beliefs about how to be happy. And this was in 1998 that he wrote this. The first iPhone came out in 2007. I would love to go back in time and hear him say this and say, Dallas, you have no idea. Think about the 24/7 bombardment just all around us on our phones, on our computers, on our screens, on billboards, just marketing at us constantly, telling us what to believe, how to view the world, what we need in life, what wisdom is, what truth is. And so I have a question that may be challenging, but I say this in love, and I say it as a challenge to myself too, is that if our only time seeking wisdom from Jesus happens 1 hour out of the 168 of every week, what do you think will be our source of wisdom? What do you think is going to shape our worldview? How will we be equipped to receive and interpret this bombardment of information and interpret and respond like Jesus? Paul says we have this complete access to Jesus' wisdom. But far too many of us continue to live in flatland. We live as if nothing has changed, as if there isn't this other kingdom that is among us. So that's my first point, is to be a disciple as Christ calls us to, and to put forth the effort to learn from Christ, to be a student of Christ. And then my second and final point here is to learn wisdom in community. We're not supposed to do this alone. These communities can happen in relationships that aren't intergenerational, but I want to just take a moment to speak specifically in light of this bigger conversation that we've been having about growing young. That's a conversation Pastor Nate started a while ago. We've been doing this cohort with Fuller Youth Institute, and we've been examining as a church, how can we become more of an intentional intergenerational church? And that's been the conversation that has been ongoing. And so I've alluded to it before, but I think it's important for me to make this point again. Young people today live in a context that is drastically different than when most of us grew up. Even me, I remember dial-up internet, okay? But young people now have access to this right away from a young age. They're exposed to very adult issues, oftentimes beginning at the age of 14. The transition out of adolescence has become increasingly complex. And so my argument is that what young people need is not necessarily more information. They need wisdom to discern what to do with all of this. And just a theory of mine, I don't have anything to prove this, but a theory of mine is I believe part of the reason that young people aren't filling up churches is because usually churches just offer what they can get on the internet. They can listen to a sermon with a way better preacher than me or Pastor Nate. I've already talked to Pastor Nate. He's okay with me saying that. He's a great preacher. But I mean, seriously, they can listen to a TED Talk. They can listen to a sermon or podcast with compelling speakers. So why should they get out of their pajamas on a Sunday morning and come to church to get more information? And so again, I believe what young people desperately need is for others to come alongside them and walk this with them. Now, I'm always nervous when I say something like this, so I feel like I need to clarify it, even though I know most of you wouldn't do this. But this does not mean that you walk up to a random young person and say, "Greetings, young person. I would like to give you the opportunity of a lifetime for me to impart my wisdom upon you. Let me tell you how I did it when I was your age, and you can just follow my example." They will probably run away as fast as they can if you begin the conversation this way. Instead, I'm talking about walking alongside as you both live your life. And then be willing to ask questions. And instead of "when I was your age," say, "Tell me more. I don't understand all these complexities. I don't agree with all this. I'm not going to support all of this, but I want to hear and understand so I can better speak into your life." This is a two-way relationship. If you're an older person in this room, you've had your own challenges and struggles that were real when you were young. They're just different. And since I said it goes both ways, I feel like I also need to say that young people likely don't understand the struggles that you're dealing with and the complexities of what it means to grow older. And so that needs to go both ways, but as the older, wiser person, you can lead and set an example of how to do that. And I think we're just all going to be better as a result of that. The other clarification I think I need to make is that this doesn't even need, I know this is really intimidating for a lot of people to say, I don't know how to mentor someone, I don't know how to disciple someone. It doesn't even need to start off as that. You don't need to say, "I'm going to mentor you now." Just be open to starting a relationship and getting to know someone. A lot of the people that I consider to be mentors in my life, we've never had that conversation. They probably don't even know I call my mentors, but I consider them to be my mentors. I just notice, wow, these are people who are living out their faith. I want more of that. I want to hang around them more, and it just happened that way. We never had that conversation. And so I believe if you're being a student of Christ, he's going to help you figure out what that looks like as you journey along. And so finally, my last bit of advice on being students together and learning wisdom and community, I'm going to give you 5 magical words. Okay? These are wise words that will help you take that first step. You better get your pens out because this is profound stuff here. It is, "Can I buy you coffee?" Or "Can I buy you lunch?" Or "make you lunch?" I mean, seriously, don't overthink it. And if you're not ready to do that, just get to know someone in the foyer. Get to know a first name, and then get to know, their kids' names or what they're doing in college. Get to know one another. And we'll be able to journey together as we seek the wisdom of Christ. So we're going to conclude our time together by singing a song. We sang it last week, but it was just too perfect to not sing it again. I actually argued with Cody about it when we were picking songs. I was like, "We can't do it 2 weeks in a row." She's like, "Nope, we got to do it." I was like, okay. You're leading worship, so that's all right. So utilize this time. I encourage you to use this time to ask Jesus simply for wisdom. You may feel stuck in life and need his direction, but I also encourage you to pray that the Spirit reveals where your wisdom is coming from some other source rather than from Christ, some other voice, whether it's from a political news source or it's from peers or whatever it is that's not from Christ. Ask the Spirit to reveal that. And then finally, for those who have not submitted to Christ, I encourage you to be open to praying for humility, to even just be open to this. I think a lot of these Greeks just shut off and said, "It's foolishness, it's stupid, I'm not even going to talk about it." Just be open to have the humility to consider it, to think about what following the path of Christ would look like. So let's go ahead and stand up. We're going to sing, and then you'll be dismissed.